The plate was on the concrete by the back step, a curl of steam lifting into the March air like a question that had already been answered for me. The patio smelled like wet soil and grilled fat. 2 dogs nosed the plate and glanced at me as if I might bark back. The kitchen light cast a sodium flare through the sliding door, carving everyone at the table into a tableau of silhouettes. My brother's smirk. My aunt's fork held midair. My younger sister's eyes on the cloth runner she'd ironed herself. Ethan lifted his glass. "Your plate's outside with the dogs," he said, and let the silence stamp it into the room. I stepped out onto the patio, felt the grit under my heels, and said, as calmly as if I were commenting on the weather, "Understood." The word left my mouth like a bead of glass cooling in water. Behind me, someone laughed softly. Somewhere inside the house, a phone buzzed and then stopped. What I remember next is the clock on my own nightstand. Sorry, 12 a.m., and the number that climbed while I turned on my back and watched the window edge lighten. 14 missed calls. 14 in under an hour, all from the same 2 threads. The will reading was at 10. Estimates had come like rumors carried on the same wind that now tugged the curtain. $128 million, maybe more, depending on what the house appraised at. I had 72 hours, a phrase I had heard last week regarding an entirely different matter, and curiosity sat beside me like a polite guest who's already seen the ending. The plate would be cold by now. I got up, showered, and put on the navy dress my mother once said made me look like a person who knew where the papers were kept. Understood. Who I am. My name is Lydia Shaw. In this version of the city, I am the person who notices when the minute hand clicks into its tooth and the whole gear train shifts. I coordinate freight routes for a logistics firm that sees patterns before most people feel the weather. My job is to move quietly inside other people's delays, plot the workarounds, and keep the temper of the day from boiling over. I do numbers and names and timings, which is to say I make room for human error and I track it until it becomes a map. Once, when I was 9, my mother, Eleanor, set a chessboard on the kitchen table while a storm combed the pane and told me to end games before I started them. "Openings are manners," she said, pinching a white pawn. "Endings are memory." She let me move, and with each loss, she asked me where I had seen it. The question annoyed me until it didn't. By the time I left for college, I had a dog-eared folder of every bill paid late, every number called and not picked up, the exact date our father moved out, and the day he came back with a bouquet too red for the kitchen. The folder went into a plastic bin labeled wreck. I never thought it would matter this much. The last winter, I visited my mother on Thursdays. She put a hand on my wrist and told me she'd put the papers where you would look first. She didn't say the word trust, not then, but her eyes moved to the old blue file box on the bookcase. "Move 1 brick," she murmured and smiled. The lever, what they try to take. It started. Of course, with keys. 3 days before the dinner, Ethan texted a photo of the front of my building and wrote, "Mina's moving in Sunday. Don't make it weird." There was an attached PDF titled Assignment of Tenancy, full of clipped language that still had my name in the draft marks. In our family, assignment is a word we used for chores. Who took out the trash? Who got mom to her lab appointments? Who handled the meat counter during holidays because it made my aunt squeamish? Seeing it applied to my apartment felt like waking in a hotel room and asking which door was the door out. Mom would have wanted it, he added, and followed with a thumb-up emoji. The paper, on closer read, wasn't just badly written. It was a copy of a template that would have looked official to anyone who wanted to believe official things. By signature below, it said, "The undersigned agrees to assign the entirety of her rights and interests to the new occupant, a family member in good faith." No landlord's countersign. No management company letterhead. At the bottom, a line where my name had been typed and then deleted, badly. The lever had 2 prongs. One was the apartment. It always is a place first, where you can be located and then erased. The other was a piece of paper that smelled like ink drying in a hurry. A pre-transition authorization, asking me to consent to consolidate non-probate accounts before the will reading for efficiency. In small italics, time sensitive. Already signed in black felt tip with a version of my mother's name that tucked the L's into a loop she never used when she was tired. When I held it up to the kitchen light, I did not see the faint ridge my mother's pen always left where she paused before the W. I saw a practiced imitation. I felt what happens before anger, the coolness that makes a list, the shift, receipts of erosion. There is a way paper talks when people are in a hurry. The bank sent me a push alert that my profile had updates. When I logged in, a red banner flashed, "Contact branch, status needs review." The profile name said, "Deceased." When I brought my phone to the branch, they pulled my mother's file and a man with kind eyes said, "Ms. Shaw, someone submitted a notice." He lifted a gloved hand before I could speak further. "We'll make this right." It was a weird compliment, that phrase, like a salesman calling you honest. Receipts stack when you watch them. A printed thread of emails from Ethan to a real estate agent. "We'll transfer Lydia's unit by assignment. She's complying." Attached, the same PDF with my name shaved out. My signature replaced by a squiggle like a long river. A photograph Mina sent me of a couch in a van. "We're at your place in an hour," she wrote. "Keys?" A sticker on the van door said "Borrow Buddy" in cheerful block letters. A screen grab from our mother's email account forwarded to me by mistake. "Pre-transition" in the subject line. The message body referred to cleaning registers and reissuing checks. It was the kind of language people use when they want to sound like they've been around desks their whole lives. A manila envelope slipped under my door. Withdrawal slips with notes in a hand like my brother's when he was trying hard to impress a teacher. No numbers. Just dates. The shape of the erosion sank in. Less about taking what was mine. More about moving the floor while I tried to stand. I put each thing in plastic sleeves in the blue file box I had taken from my mother's bookcase the night she told me where to look. The box smelled faintly of cedar and old paper. The top layer was a trust certificate with a name that made my chest expand. Blue Harbor Trust. It was not a metaphor. It was the color of her eyes some days by the window. It had my name on the line that said trustee, and my signature where I could see the ridge from my pen. The small place I always hesitated before writing the S of Shaw, the ally, and the motif line. Her name was Priya Menon, and she wore a navy blazer that made her look like she'd never had to rush. Caldwell Trust Company was 3 floors above the coffee shop where Ethan liked to play entrepreneur with men who used their thumb and ring finger to smooth their ties when they said liquidity. I made an appointment, and when she opened the door to the conference room, she had already printed the documents. "Ms. Shaw," she said, and it wasn't a question. We sat with a carafe of water between us, and the kind of silence that makes people tell you what you need. I slid the pre-transition authorization across the table. Priya did not touch it at first. She leaned toward it, as if watching a hatchling breathe. Then she smiled, brief and not unkind. "Hold the paper still, and the ink confesses," she said, and I felt the line enter the room like a motif in music that returns when the score requires it. She lifted the trust certificate. "Good day for you to be who you are." "My mother named it Blue Harbor," I said. Priya nodded. "The will reading tomorrow is about the theater of endings," she said, tapping the certificate. "But this is the engine." She showed me the assignment my brother had mocked up. There isn't a landlord countersign. There's no leaseholder consent. And you've already... She looked at the next paper in the folder and paused in appreciation. "Yes, you've already filed the notice." I had filed it the week my mother asked me to bring her the cedar box. The apartment, I should say now, was not mine anymore in any way that would matter to Ethan. That was the decoy. I'd sold it in January to a schoolteacher named Renee who paid in a way that made me like her more. Earnest, exact, on time. The proceeds had gone where they were meant to go, into the Blue Harbor. On a timetable my mother and I set with a pencil on the kitchen table in December. Priya placed her hand on the trust certificate. "You have the authority to request a courtesy freeze on activity touching related accounts," she said, and then added gentler, "if you want to." I heard the caution and the unspoken warning about what happens to families when they meet institutions. She slid a page toward me that was in a font that made words look self-evident. "It's less a freeze than a pause while we verify." She took a breath. 72 hours, usually. "Understood," I said. "Move 1 brick," she said. Eyes kind, and let the wall fall. The move, decisive, non-technical. I scanned the decoy authorization to myself, the trust certificate, the recorded voicemail I had saved from my mother while she was strong enough to tease me. "You always think 3 moves ahead. Too bad there are more squares than moves, kiddo." I packed the physical originals in the blue box and left it where I always do, Not in my closet, not under a bed, but in plain view on a shelf with the cookbooks. People never look at recipes when they're looking to take. At 9 that night, I sent a single email to Caldwell Trust Company to my mother's attorney, and to the compliance address Ethan had forwarded me the pre-transition PDF from. Subject line, courtesy pause requested, Blue Harbor Trust. The body was a sentence long and attached were documents that spoke for me. I do not enjoy fireworks. I do like switches. At 7 the next morning, I called Harbor First Bank and made an appointment. The branch manager had a face like a person who has had to tell both good and bad news before coffee. I slid my phone to him with the red deceased banner up and waited while he clicked through internal menus I recognized in structure but not in name. He said the 3 words institutions use when they decide to behave like people. We are sorry. Someone got a little excited, he said gently. We'll clear it. He looked up. 72 hours, at most. I have a will reading at 10, I said, and smiled. It won't disrupt that, he shook his head. If anyone asks you for consent today, say you need to review. He added, quietly. At 8, I texted Renee, my buyer, my quiet ally without knowing it. Today, I wrote simply. You may get visitors. We had arranged this before. The keys had already changed hands. The locks had been replaced on her schedule, not mine. Cement fills in when it must. At 9:50, I walked into Klein & Town LLP and took a seat in a conference room that smelled like lemon oil and paper. Ethan was already there in a jacket that looked new, sitting with Mina, whose hair was pinned up, making her look younger. Our aunt fanned herself with a folded schedule. The lawyer, Mr. Klein, had a head like a seal and eyes that missed little. He greeted each of us with the kind of warmth you can't fake without leaning too hard on your voice. We'll begin with expressions of condolence, he said, and then did not make us suffer too long. He opened a folder the color of a bruise and pulled out a will with a ribbon like old days. He read in a tone that neither apologized nor demanded. I listened for the part where the room would change shape. He read bequests that made sense. A necklace to my aunt, a letter to an old friend whose name I recognized from my mother's address book. And then, regarding the residue of my estate, currently estimated at approximately $1,280,000, he said, like a person accidentally reading a number on a stage. I direct that said residue shall pour over into the Blue Harbor Trust, which I established on December 14th, with my daughter, Lydia Shaw, as trustee. Ethan did not look at me. He reached for his glass. I watched his hand. It paused, a fraction too long. I heard Priya's voice in my head. Hold the paper still and the ink confesses. Mr. Klein kept reading. Any non-probate account shall be included under the trust's umbrella and administered in accordance with its terms. He put the will down. Questions? Ethan made a sound that could have been a laugh. We discussed a pre-transition, he said. For efficiency? Mr. Klein folded his hands. Pre-transition is a term of art you don't get to use outside of a coffee shop, he said without heat. Nothing moves without the trustee. Mina looked at me, then at the table. She bit the inside of her cheek. I remembered her 8 years old, digging holes for tulips with me, talking about how worms aren't gross when they're busy. I felt the memory like a singer might feel the note before they open their mouth. Lydia, Ethan said, turning to me at last. The smirk softened, revealing the boy who once picked a splinter from my palm with his own trembling fingers. We should talk. After, I said. At the apartment? The fallout, visible consequences. We didn't make it to 10:10 before the phone started twitching on the table. 14 notifications, rolling in on top of each other until the surface of the phone looked like a swarm. Mina's text. We're on the way to your place. Renee hasn't answered. My aunt. Family first. A friend of Ethan's. Got the truck. Need a loading zone. 2 numbers I didn't recognize. Assignment doc needs your sign. I put the phone face down and let the room be the room. I thanked Mr. Klein, not for the bequests, which were fine, but for not making anything more theatrical than it had to be. He didn't stand to shake our hands, which felt right and merciful. Ethan was already typing before he reached the hallway. Keys, he wrote. The word looked strange in typed form, like a line from a dictionary scraped free of context. I drove in the direction of my old building, which was no longer mine and yet still had the imprint of my footsteps on the stairwell. The air smelled like rain on brick, the kind of smell that makes you think of promises you won't necessarily say out loud. On the way, I posted, for the only time that day, a short thread on my private account, visible to the same small circle that had sent me soup recipes when my mother was in hospice. There's talk of an assignment, I wrote. For clarity, I sold the apartment in January. The new owner is a teacher named Renee. Please respect her space. I attached a photo of the recorded deed, my signature a small ridged line under the notary stamp. I turned the phone off. I arrived as the first argument was already losing shape. Renee stood in her doorway with her chin raised. She wore a sweater dotted with paint and a lanyard with keys that glinted like a small constellation. An officer stood beside her, body cam light a small unblinking eye near his shoulder. Ethan had his hands out, not unlike a person who intends to calm a horse he has already spooked. "She's my sister," he told the officer, as if that could be both the key and the lock. "Ma'am," the officer said to Renee, and I loved him a little for it. "You signed a deed in January?" "Yes," she said. "With Ms. Shaw." She looked at me then and nodded slightly. We had met the day she came to measure the windows. I had plugged in a space heater for her, and she had told me about the book she was teaching. "Birds, Migration Patterns, Home. Do you have a copy?" the officer asked, formal but not cold. Renee lifted a folder. "Recorded," she said, and countersigned. "Copy for me?" the officer asked. He turned his shoulder slightly so the camera could catch the pages. For the record, I said, and I don't know why that was the line that unknotted something in my chest. Ethan looked past me, as if there were a third person in the conversation whom he could appeal to, who would understand about efficiency. He put his hand on Mina's shoulder. "Mom wanted family in the building," he said. The sentence delivered like a moral. "Mom wanted the papers followed," I said quietly, and watched him process what a sentence can do when there's nothing to push against. I stepped aside, letting the light hit the officer's camera clean. "You don't live here," the officer said to Ethan and Mina without malice. "And she does," he added, nodding at Renee. "If you need to retrieve property, schedule it in writing with the resident. Not today." 14 missed calls, Ethan said to me, as if repetition were a spell. "I turned my phone off," I said. "I fed you to the dogs," he said. And it was such a strange confession that I almost smiled. "You fed my plate to the dogs," I corrected. "I ate at home." "Move one brick," Priya had said. The wall was doing the rest, the confrontation scene. "Let's talk," Ethan said. Later, when the officer had walked them to the curb and waited, still and present, the way clean lines in a sketch hold the shape of a figure together. We stood near the bench by the municipal tree whose roots had pushed the bricks into gentle humps. The officer's body cam caught the scene in profile. "You're making it ugly," Ethan said, a small attempt at dignity that sounded like a man apologizing to a mirror. "I'm not making anything," I said. "I'm not moving anything. That's the point. You always liked paper," he said. "Paper likes me," I said. "It's about temperament." "We could have handled the pre-transition," he said. "The bank flagged me as deceased," I said calmly. He inhaled. I let the silence extend. "I didn't do that," he said. "I didn't say you did." I watched a woman across the street coax a toddler into a stroller, the kind of scene you can use as a metronome when you need to say a thing you'd rather not. "What you did do," I said, "was assign our sister to my home, which I no longer own. You used a document with my name shaved out and hoped the shape of the absence would convince me to fill it." "I thought she'd be safe there," he said. "She is safe," I said, and nodded at the window where Renee had taped a drawing from her class of a bird in flight. "We gave it to someone who locks her door." "I fed your plate to the dogs," he said a second time, as if rehearsing how remorse might feel. I said, "Understood," I replied. "It wasn't consent. It was prediction." He looked at the officer now as if he might ask if prediction had standing. The officer said nothing. He simply adjusted his stance so his body cam framed us. I could picture the footage later. Clean sound, clipped sentences, no crosstalk. An on-record thing that could be put away and pulled back out. "Ethan," I said, and I tried to say his name with all the years in it. "There's a reading and there's an engine. Today you got both. You can stop pushing on doors that aren't yours. It's easier that way." He nodded tightly, which I knew not to mistake for agreement. 14 missed calls, he said, for the third time. It had become its own kind of mantra. "And 72 hours, I added gently. Use them to decide what you're going to be on the other side of this. He glanced down at his shoes, then up at the sky. This is a lot, he said. It is, I said. And then it isn't. The reckoning, formal boundary decision. The bank reset my status by end of day 2. A branch officer called to say, "You're back among the living, Ms. Shaw," in a tone that tried for levity and landed close enough to kindness that I told him he had done his job well. Caldwell Trust Company sent a letter on heavy paper that said, in words smoothed by many such letters, that a courtesy pause had been placed on relevant accounts pending routine verification and that the trustee, me, would be notified of any requests. It did not mention Ethan, did not mention Mina, did not mention that Mr. Klein had sent a certified note to a general counsel at Harbor First, with a phrase I enjoyed more than I should have. Decanting is improper where the intention is evasion rather than administration. At probate court the following week, because things do move slower than stories. Even when you prepare, the judge read into the record the line that mattered. "The Blue Harbor Trust," she said, "is valid on its face and in its execution." I felt something unclench that I hadn't realized I'd pinned in place. Ethan chose not to attend. Mina did. She wore a cardigan the color of wet sand and kept her eyes on the table. After, she slipped out quickly but paused in the hallway when she saw me. "I didn't know he'd put your plate outside," she said. It took me a moment to realize this was her way of stepping into the record, too. "Don't apologize for other people's choreography," I said. "Just choose a different dance." Renee sent me a photo that afternoon of a small piece of paper she'd found in the hall by the mailboxes. Assignment, in the subject line. No content. "Looks like someone dropped their script," she wrote. I wrote back, "Let the stagehands sweep." In the same week, a letter came from Klein in town detailing something my mother had done that made me laugh out loud alone in my kitchen. She had written a decoy check to cash for an amount that looked meaningful, but was just shy of a threshold that would have flagged an automatic review. She then recorded a video on Mr. Klein's office phone, addressing whoever might watch. "If you found this," she said straight at the lens, hair in a soft scarf, eyes bright, "then you were looking for what you weren't meant to have. I love you anyway. Blue Harbor has what matters. Put the check in your pocket if it soothes you. It's a decoy. Call Lydia if you feel like being the person you hoped you were." I watched it twice, then put the flash drive back in its case as if tucking a baby into a crib. It wasn't a full restitution in the story sense. It was the way the ground firms after rain. Mr. Klein filed a trespass notice that included Renee by name and left me off, as we intended. The officer from that day stopped me once on the sidewalk to tell me that the body cam footage had been clean, and I thanked him for being steady where a better story might have liked heat. "Institutions don't redeem anyone," my mother used to say. "They simply keep our worst days from winning." I believed her. More that week than I ever had, aftermath and meaning. On the day the bank letter came, the formal one, heavy paper, court seal in the top left and a new file number underneath, I made soup in a pot my mother had used for chili. I didn't season it fast. I let it do what simmering does. The apartment smelled like onion and a memory I could walk into. It should have felt triumphant. It felt quiet, which is better. I took the blue box down and added the bank letter to the trust certificate with a clear sleeve between them, a kind of glass pane to remember the view. I sat at the table and wrote the words "Move one brick" on an index card in a hand that looked like mine but kinder. I taped it inside the lid. Then I took a small brass key, a spare to the old mailbox box, I no longer had reason to use, and mounted it with a thumbtack into a shadow box I'd found in a thrift store on a day I thought I was shopping for vases. The brass caught the light and threw it onto the wall in a shape like a blade, then softened as the sun shifted. I took one more thing from the box, a paper with my mother's last note to me in her small, goofy style. "Understood," it said, underlined once. I pressed it to the inside of the shadow box frame and closed the latch. The hinge clicked. The room rested. I texted Mina a photo of the shadow box and said, "Come for soup when you like." Then I put my phone face down. That night, I slid the officer's card into the back of the blue box, not because I needed it, but because sometimes a name is ballast. I slept without a dream, I remember. The next morning smelled like the end of rain. Pull quotes for on-screen moments. "Your plate's outside with the dogs." Understood. Hold the paper still and the ink confesses. Move one brick and let the wall fall. Mom wanted the papers followed. For the record, it wasn't consent. It was prediction. Institutions don't redeem anyone. They keep our worst days from winning. Understood.